Hello, and welcome to the first of 3 webinars revolving around feedback and perception of learning. So as this topic is at the very heart of teaching, we're going to explore it in some depth. We're going to start with a more conceptual discussion today, and then we will move on to our practice in the classroom, right? So today, we're focusing on an overview of feedback and perception of learning. Next week, we'll be talking about how to plan feedback, and the week after that, giving feedback. So our agenda for today is we're going to start by asking ourselves what feedback actually means, working with a few definitions. Then we'll move on to a list of 7 key features of effective feedback. And finally, we're going to talk about the impacts that feedback has on learning, of course, but also on the perception of learning. So I think a good starting point is, what is feedback, right? I'm going to ask you to step back from the classroom. Let's think of a definition of feedback which is more general, that doesn't necessarily have to do with teaching and learning English. So give you a minute to consider this. Okay, so Rafael wrote, it's a kind of reaction. Yeah, so a reaction to, let's have a look. This is the definition you get when you Google the word feedback. So it's very general. What we have is information about reactions to a product, a person's performance of a task, etc., used as a basis for improvement. So I would say that the key words here are information and reaction, of course. We have performance and we have improvement. Going forward a little bit, let me show you another definition. We have 2 here, but I'd like you to look at the second one, which is actually related to engineering. So the return back into a machine or a system of part of what it produces, especially to improve what is produced. I think even though we're talking about engineering here, it makes a lot of sense if we apply it to teaching and learning. So now let's think about what feedback means in our context, in our classroom. So what is feedback? I'll give you a minute to think. Again, what is feedback in our context of teaching and learning English? Okay, so let's start with a very general definition. Again, this is something you would find in Google if you Google feedback ELT. This is from the British Council. Oh, sorry, before I continue, Priscilla said it's something that the teacher says after an activity is over. Okay, great. So let's look at the definition from the British Council site. So feedback is information a teacher or another speaker, including another learner, gives to learners on how well they're going, either to help the learner improve specific points or to help plan their learning. Feedback can be immediate during an activity or delayed, as Priscilla just said, at the end of an activity or part of a learning program, and can take various forms, right? Okay, then we can take a look at this definition from ASCD, which is an American site on education. So the term feedback is often used to describe all kinds of comments made after the fact, including advice, praise, and evaluation. But none of these are feedback, strictly speaking. Basically, feedback is information about how we are doing in our efforts to reach a goal. So here we're getting a little more specific, right? We have obviously something that is given after an activity, after the fact, but it can't be just anything. It's more specific. It's related to how we are moving towards a goal, right? And finally, we have a definition by Hattie and Timperley from this great text called The Power of Feedback. There's more information at the end of this webinar in the bibliography. So feedback is information provided by an agent, for example, teacher, peer, book, parent, self, experience, regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding. A teacher or parent can provide corrective information. A peer can provide an alternative strategy. A book can provide information to clarify ideas. A parent can provide encouragement, and a learner can look up the answer to evaluate the correctness of a response. Feedback, thus, is a consequence of performance. This is a very important point. Learners perform, and learners then receive feedback in order to improve this performance. So before we move on and talk about the key features of effective feedback, I'd like to make a comment that I believe there are many unintentional or unconscious things that we do which are feedback to our students. And of course, they can also play an important role in learning. However, we're going to focus on what we call intentional feedback. So you walk into the classroom with the intention of including feedback in your teaching, right? So let's have a look at what the key features of feedback are. I have 7, perhaps at the end we will have more than 7, right? So first of all, let's start by thinking what you think, or what do you consider to be key features of effective feedback? If you can take some time and think of 2 or maybe 1 or 2 things which make feedback effective. Okay, so Rafael says it helps people achieve their goals, right? By the way, welcome Ian, who has joined us. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at this. But before that, just some comments about John Hattie, who we've just talked about. So Hattie works on measuring the impact that teachers have on learning. And according to him, there are studies that show that the highest, the strongest effects, one of the strongest impacts comes from students receiving information about a task and on how to do it more effectively. And he also mentions that the lowest impact is usually related to praise, rewards, and punishment. So let's see how we can actually give more effective feedback, right? So, number 1, effective feedback is transparent. That means it is tangible. I know as a learner, I know I'm being given feedback. And also I'm aware of why I'm receiving feedback. So I know of the purpose of feedback in the classroom and in my learning, right? So number two, effective feedback is specific. If you go back to the different definitions we have seen, the word information was recurrent. So we need to give information that is concrete, meaning that it makes sense within the context of what is being worked on. I accept it as a learner and I understand it as a learner. Another important point is that it must lead to action, preferably specific action. So you give feedback, but you also give information on what to do from that point. Number three, effective feedback is well-timed, meaning generally, we believe that the sooner the better. So we would, before we proceed, yes, Rafael wrote here, he says it becomes feed forward for sure. So you give feedback and also feed forward, meaning you tell people where to go from there. You tell your students what can be done with the feedback they have received. Great, Rafael, great contribution. So in general, we believe that the sooner the better, so feedback should be immediate. However, there are moments where delayed feedback is a lot more effective. And of course, we're not going to get into these details now, but I think it's important to say at this point that you may decide to give delayed feedback, sure, but feedback that is given long after a task has been completed is not feedback at all, really, because you have lost the context. The context is not there anymore. I cannot, as a learner, I cannot relate the feedback you're giving to me with anything more concrete, right? Okay, number four, effective feedback is ongoing and it's intertwined with instruction, intertwined with teaching. So we need to start thinking of effective feedback as assessment, not assessment in the sense of giving your students grade, but of assessing their production so you are better able to help them from that point. So feedback is very much part of formative assessment, and it should be ongoing in the sense that you are always listening to your students, you're always paying attention to your students, you are always there for assessing your students, and then you respond to what you have heard and seen and so on. I'm not sure you're familiar with this saying, but there's this saying, there is no failure, only feedback, meaning that you perform a task, and if you receive feedback, the fact that you might have failed at this task is only an opportunity to perform again. Whereas if I perform a task and I do not receive any feedback, there is no way forward. Also, feedback should be consistent. So consistent in the sense of, are you applying the same criteria to the way you're giving feedback, to the language you're giving feedback on, for example? Are you considering what language is important at that point, which might not be that important the following lesson, for example, right? So it has to be consistent with what is expected from the students at that level. It's consistent with, then we go outside the classroom, it's consistent with what other teachers expect from that level. So this is something perhaps we should be working on a little bit more in the staff room. Are we talking about feedback, what we're giving feedback on and how and so on, right? Number 5 is effective feedback is goal-oriented. So what are we talking about? Goals, the learning goals should be clear to students. And feedback should be clear enough and clearly related to the goals, right? Rafael made a comment here, also how we give feedback on writing. Yes, feedback on writing is something that needs to be standardized all the time, isn't it? How are we giving feedback on writing? What are we expecting from different levels? Same for speaking. Are we all on the same page? This is an important point. So goal-oriented, clear goals, clear feedback. These goals they range from immediate goals to long-term goals. So you might be giving feedback at one point on something related to a very immediate goal, for example, the outcome of that lesson, or you might be giving feedback related to a long-term goal that you know your students have. Okay, so whatever the goal is, it has to be clear in your feedback as well. So in your feedback should include information related to those goals. Effective feedback is also careful and user-friendly. What does that mean? Well, feedback is all about learning. It's not about testing. So when we give feedback, what message are we sending to our students? What are we conveying to our students? That they were wrong, that they have failed, or that they're learning? So the way we invite students to receive feedback is very important. Also, we need to be sensitive to the amount of feedback we're giving and on what. So am I going to give feedback on simply everything, or am I going to select? What is the right amount for that group or that student specifically? So there's a lot to be considered there, because this is all about how students are dealing with the feedback they're receiving. And finally, effective feedback involves learners, meaning learners should be invited to assess their own production and learning. So you're going to listen to learners, present perhaps initially what they have produced, and then invite them to assess what they have produced. Rafael says, sometimes students say they want you to correct all the mistakes they make, which can be tricky. I agree, Rafael. I think this is an important kind of conversation to have with learners at the very beginning of the semester, because you can talk to them about how they feel regarding being corrected, explain to them, for example, that you might be correcting on the spot sometimes, other times delayed feedback. You can ask them about their preferences, but I would suggest telling learners that yes, you're going to correct them, but you are going to select the mistakes which are more relevant. I think when you make your teaching more transparent like this, you also gain your students' trust because they feel, okay, so this teacher knows what they're doing, so I think it's all about transparency. So, and involving learners, of course, so they know what you're doing and why. And John Hattie says that teaching should be visible to learners and learning should be visible to teachers. So I don't think we should be afraid of sometimes making our teaching more transparent. So by inviting students to assess their own production, you are helping them develop learning strategies and thus develop autonomy. So if I invite my learners to look at their own production and assess, not only correct what was wrong, but actually assess, like in all kinds of different aspects that we're going to discuss later on. If I do this, I am also encouraging them to do this outside of the classroom. And so they will be more autonomous users of the English language, or autonomous learners. Rafael says peer feedback can be helpful too. I agree. They need guidance. Yes, we're very comfortable, let's say, with the word feedback, the term feedback. We use it all the time. So when you say give feedback to a student, what happens? How does he interpret this word? If you ask students to give feedback to each other, what's going to happen, do you think? It's worth thinking about. I think it's a bit dangerous even, it's a bit risky. So yes, they need guidance. So do encourage your students to give feedback to each other, but following certain guidelines. So listen to your peer and give feedback on his ideas. So do you agree or not? That's one. But listen to your peer and give feedback on whether he used the vocabulary that we have just worked on. Or as Rafael suggested, now choose one aspect that was very successful. That's it. So I think that there are ideas that will give your students some guidance when they are going to give feedback to their peers. So now we've looked at the 7 key features, which we are going to revisit very briefly next week when we talk about planning feedback, right? Now we've discussed that, I would like us to think about the impact that feedback has on perception of learning. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about this. How do the two connect? How can feedback help our students perceive that they are making progress? So how do learners perceive their own progress? That's kind of a mystery, really, I suppose. The assumptions are that they perceive progress through grades, like very, very concrete measure, let's say, of your progress, as long as you see the assessment process as being valid. Another way to perceive your own progress is by comparing yourself to your peers. A third way would be to successfully use language, meaning you have been able to use language successfully outside the classroom. You were able to get something done in English. And of course, last but not least, feedback. So let's look at the aspect of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our belief in our ability to succeed in specific situations or accomplishing a task. So this is a concept that has been worked on for a while by Schunk and Pajares. And they consider feedback to play a very important role in the development of self-efficacy because it's a persuasive source of self-efficacy information. The information I receive will help me believe more strongly in my ability to succeed, not succeed in a general sense, although of course that also happens, but in specific situations with specific tasks and so on. So it can help develop self-efficacy as it informs students of their capabilities and progress in learning. And this information motivates students to continue to perform well. So feedback it plays a very important role in the development of my belief in my learning, in my ability to learn. This is particularly important, I think, when we talk about adult learners, right? Rafael was saying here that Priscilla agrees. Yeah. Adult learners, because of their experience in history and studying English, they many times come to us with the idea that they do not have the ability to learn, right? And this we can see the classroom, how they will react to certain tasks and so on. So many times we respond to this by working on their more effective, working with them on a more effective level. So you say, oh, don't worry, and we try to reassure them, which is fine, that's important as well. But this reassurance must be accompanied by something a little more specific and concrete, which is feedback. So through feedback, you're not telling, but you're showing. So important here, again, especially for adult learners who do not perceive their own progress. And again, quoting Hattie, the main purpose of feedback is to reduce discrepancies between current understanding and a performance and goal. So the gap that students notice between what they know and what they would like to know, or what they can do and what they would like to be able to do, this gap is quite important in the sense that, yes, it's important that students notice that there is a difference, but this gap needs to be reduced, and students need to see that this gap is being reduced, and this is where feedback comes in. So we should address the issue of this distance between what the learner knows and what he would like to know or what he needs to know. We need to address it, but always through feedback. Remember, specific feedback, feedback that leads to action, right? Because this gap is learning itself, right? So just to wrap up, I'd like to know if you have any questions, any comments. Okay, so Rafael was asking about young learners and teens. Yeah, that's it's an interesting question, because when we talk about perception of learning, we do think of adults, isn't it? So I think with teens, we are a bit closer to, like, in terms of giving feedback, with teens, we're a bit closer, aren't we, to the way we do it with adults. But young learners, what I notice is that we tend to praise, very general praise. Oh, that was very good, etc. And perhaps this is not the best way. Perhaps we can, of course, praise for sure, but we can be more specific. So, okay, very good. You managed to, understand the story. You managed to create a different ending to the story. You managed to describe your school uniform, look, the color, etc. So I think it's worth doing this, like being more specific as well. Obviously on a different level, but yes, why not be a little more specific with children and teens, right? Okay, so to wrap up, I'll just tell you about next week. We have a webinar at 10, repeat session at 12. But next week we're focusing on actually planning feedback. And this is the bibliography used for today's webinar. And if you have any questions for me, if you'd like to get in touch, this is my email. And thank you so much. And I hope to see you next week.